Good evening. So now I'm going to read you the first chapter of one of my favourite books from Judith Cutler. So this is called The Legacy of Death. This is the first in this series, and on the back by Kirkus Reviews of The Wages of Sin says, a promising series debut with engaging characters, social commentary and a Victorian twist on the ever-popular upstairs-downstairs storyline. So this is a really lovely book, and I'm not biased really because it says for Rachel, Olivia and Thomas of all my love, so she dedicated this one to us, bless her. And I love this one, and of course it's signed on the other page, so I'm a massive Judith Cutler fan. So as you can see, great crime and, if you like, strong female protagonists, this is the one for you. So I'm going to just crack on and read you chapter 1 from The Legacy of Death, because I love that title. 1. My daily walk takes me to the site of the new model village. It always pleases me to see how fast the work is progressing, despite the shortness of the winter days, but today something is wrong. The labourers are resting on the handles of their picks and shovels. Thomas the foreman is wiping sweat from his brow. He scrambles out of the trench as I appear and comes towards me, waving his hands as if I'm a sheep that has gone the wrong way. I am also almost expecting him to say, "Shoo." But I realise his eyes are full of fear. "No, Mrs. Faulkner, Mrs. Rowsley, I mean. No, don't look, ma'am. 'Tis not fit for a lady's eyes. 'Tis a body, ma'am, a dead body." Mr. Wilson cast his eyes around Thorncroft House's red dining room, where we had gathered round the long mahogany table, watched from the walls by his lordship's ancestors. None of them was welcoming, with two portrayed by Lely particularly disdainful. Welcome to this, the first meeting of the trustees of Lord Croft's estate, convened to oversee both its day-to-day and its long-term needs. I believe we are all here now, gentlemen, and ladies, of course, he added with a patronising smile that could not fail to raise the hackles of at least two of those present, though they both responded with dignified nods. Irritated though I was, had I not clearly explained to him that all, regardless of rank and sex, must be accorded the same respect? Rather than interrupt, I resolved to speak to him as he left. Perhaps, Wilson continued, as unctuous as it was possible for a solicitor to be, in view of the solemnity of our business, before we are seated, we might open with a prayer. Mr. Pounceman? That was an invitation the Reverend Theophilus Pounceman would never decline. A severe attack of mumps in the summer had left him somewhat thinner, but had by no means dented his elegant carapace. In another milieu he might have been a dandy. In the environs of the church he dressed and lived like a prince, though he was simply the rector of St. Anselm's, the village church. The generous living had been bestowed on him by the previous Lord Croft. In his late 30s, his good looks and excellent prospects might have made him seem very attractive as a potential husband, but I had not yet met a woman who even liked him. As for his view, he disdained what he always referred to as the weaker sex. The long exhortation of the Almighty to restore Lord Croft to health was countered by a plea that we might enjoy a long and profitable association. Perhaps I was not the only one who registered a word that was decidedly suspect. As land agent, I wished to be visibly meticulous in a role I had always performed with the clearest of consciousness, never taking more than my contractual salary. Hence my discussions with the family solicitor, Montgomery Wilson, respected for his probity and probably even his pomosity throughout Shropshire, who had agreed my suggestions for people who were eligible by dint of their closeness to the family or as noteworthy members of the village of Thorncroft. In addition to Pounceman were our village doctor, Ellis Page, Tetrius Newcombe, a prosperous farmer, Samuel Bowman, the butler, who had dedicated his life to the family, Mrs. Beatrice Arden, the cook, my dear wife Harriet, once Mrs. Faulkner, and the housekeeper. I have received an apology for absence from Mr. Martin Baines, and my clerk has taken note of those attending, Wilson said. So we can proceed to the first item on the agenda, conversion of the family wing to a lunatic asylum for his lordship and his mother. Samuel Bowman arrived, After some 50 years in service, he was, however, so used to waiting until he was spoken to that he could do no more than stare at me. I think most of us would prefer a term that carried less opprobrium, I said. Her ladyship is not far from deaf, I believe. Dr. Page nodded his agreement, and his lordship's disorder may well be a result of not his own, but his father's indiscretions. Let us call them by their correct name, Pouncement declared. Transgressions, sins of the flesh. His late lordship, Mr. Chairman, is not here to defend himself, Harriet said with such quiet assurance she might have been speaking at formal meetings like this all her life. But I agree, as I think we all do, that we should perhaps refer to the family wing by another term than lunatic asylum. Mr. Bowman was speaking of this earlier. She nodded across the table to her colleague, her beautiful hair confined under a much less unflattering cap these days, gleaming in the candlelight. Wilson nodded towards Samuel. Mr. Bowman. All of us servants have always called it the family wing. We don't need to change its name. Mr. Chairman, there are new locks on the doors. There are bars at the windows. It is safe. It does not need to lose its dignity. Wilson nodded. His clerk, a sad-faced youth in a suit, a size too large, scratched at his paper. Family wing it is, Wilson declared, and the changes to the fabric, Mr. Rowsley. I believe Mr. Bowman has already alluded to some of them. Indeed, the estate carpenter has also installed some extra doors for security. He has gone to great pains to ensure they are in keeping with the house. However, he assures me that as and when it is safe to remove them, it can be done so with no major damage to the fabric. So all is well on that front. Does anyone have anything else to add? Very well, let us proceed to the next item. Guards, or do you prefer another name, Mr. Bowman? How would he react to the sarcasm? The staff will refer to them as attendants or nurses, Samuel responded with a slow dignity that matched his unusually sober waistcoat. After all, many of them used to be in regular service here as footmen or maids. Dr. Page has had them trained. Page was not going to wait to be patronised. As a country doctor, Mr. Chairman, I did not consider myself sufficiently au fait with current developments in the treatment of such illnesses, so I invited experts from the country asylum and the Royal Salop Infirmary to instruct those who volunteered for new roles. Wilson, outgunned, nodded. And the rest of the staff? He looked at me. I can tell you that all of the outdoor staff have remained in place, with the exception of the family's personal grooms, both of whom have sought and found employment elsewhere. They are very loyal, and I am sure they will be discreet, I added. As to the others, Mr. Rowsley, As to others, Mrs. Rowsley is responsible for the maids, Mrs. Arden for the kitchen staff, and Mr. Bowman for the footmen. Harriet and Samuel, despite his initial anxieties, reported confidently on changes, only Beatrice Arden showing any sign of nervousness. She too sported a less ugly cap. So many staff still employed, Pouncement jumped in. Really, Rowsley, how can you possibly justify that? This from a man who employed at least 8 servants to nurture him. For answers I looked at Wilson, who peered over his spectacles. Mr. Pouncement, I would be more than grateful if you would address all your comments through the chair. There would appear to be a large number of people still drawing wages, Mr. Rowsley. For answer, I passed him a copy of the wages bill for the last 3 years. With your permission, Mr. Chairman, I distributed further copies to the others. As you will see, the servants, whatever work they are doing, are not highly paid. A building such as this is not for the present occupier alone. It must be kept in trust for his heir. The fabric and fittings must be preserved in the best possible state, and to do this we must rely on my colleagues' expertise. As and when staff find new employment elsewhere, the posts they leave vacant may or may not be filled. That will be at the discretion of those directly supervising them, or this committee, if the members prefer. My opinion, for what it is worth, Wilson said, is that such decisions might well be left to those with the requisite knowledge and experience. Are we all agreed? Ah, Mr. Pouncement. We are trustees for a reason, sir. We are to oversee what is done so no one takes advantage of a delicate situation. How are we to know that there is no nepotism, no other sort of favouritism? Dr. Page raised his pen. Mr. Chairman, I should imagine that these loyal employees around the table with us have never had much in the way of supervision from anything except their consciences, with which, to the best of my knowledge, they have imbued their underlings. Perhaps if any exceptional remuneration is to be made, and they are in any doubt, they should report to Mr. Rowsley as land agent. Although that has always been the case, Mr. Chairman, I am more than happy to cede my powers of approval to those of us gathered here. I still believe we should approve all the accounts, not just wages, but other expenditure. We do not want the estate to become Rowsley's milch cow, do we? I see that he has appointed a clerk to assist him. I had. Freddie, a bright lad, once the stable hand at the village pub. Harriet had taught him to read, and though I paid him in shillings, not pounds at the moment, he was no more than 11 or 12. I was sure he would one day become a professional man in his own right. Mr. Pounceman, I would remind you that it was at Mr. Rowsley's personal suggestion that this board was formed. I think you might keep such insinuations to yourself in future. Wilson rocketed in my estimation. You will note that he is required by our articles to submit his accounts to us once they have been scrutinised by one of my more expert colleagues. Now I fear we have wandered from the agenda. Pounceman raised a hand. I would like to table a motion. Wilson shook his head. Then you must raise the topic at any other business, sir. There is something else to be raised then too. So let us turn our attention to the next item, rebuilding Stammerton. He contrived to ignore Pounceman's still raised hand. Mr. Rowsley, thank you for submitting these drawings and estimates up to us all in advance. Our discussion can now be informed, not a matter of speculation. I am sure you would all like to comment, but I must remind you to comment through me as chairman. My clerk will take note of everything you say. Dr. Page? Page acknowledged the invitation with a nod. There are those who may consider such a wholesale change an extravagance. However, as a doctor who regularly sees the effects of living in such hovels as pass for cottages, the effects of not eating because there is no food available, I support Mr. Rowsley's proposal wholeheartedly. If the foundations could be dug tomorrow, it would not be too soon for me. Thank you, Mr. Newcombe. I'm glad it's not my money being spent, that's all I can say, but I agree. Many of those cottages are a disgrace. Mr. Rowsley and I have had conversations in the past, and it can be admitted there are things over which we have not seen eye to eye. However, persuaded by his arguments, I have started to improve my own labourers' places, little by little, and I've also given them plots for allotments. I have to admit, ladies and gentlemen, they are more cheerful as a result. They work harder too, so maybe there's an element of self-interest in Rowley's plans. As for the school, they say that Parliament will soon be insisting on free education for all our children, and being a step ahead is never a bad thing. But I warn you, universal education will change things, and not always for the better. He paused. It's a nice little church proposed there. You must be pleased as Punch, Mr. Pounceman. Sorry, Mr. Chairman. I would imagine Mr. Pounceman must be pleased as Punch. Whatever the vicar wanted to say, he would have to wait. Wilson invited Samuel, who had bravely raised her hand, to speak. Mrs. Rowsley knows more about teaching and so on than I do, but I can tell you this. When we get the youngest servants into the house, they are poor, weedy specimens, weak and pretty well useless. But then they get 3 good meals a day, and they are transformed. So I say the allotments are a good idea, which means the cottages need a means of cooking their food, a real kitchen, and it's not decent the way families are crammed together, boys and girls, children and grown-ups, so they need proper bedrooms. Pounceman was shaking his head. Eventually Wilson noticed and invited him to speak. Our Lord said we would have the poor always with us. It is right to give them alms, to admit them to the workhouse if they are deserving. But these cottages will be given to the deserving and non-deserving alike. How can you, Mr. Rowsley, house a man drinks away his earnings next to a sober, God-fearing man who comes to church? A school. I agree with Mr. Newcombe that it will give people ideas above their station and cause unrest. A cricket pitch in the village green, that will encourage idle loitering. Harriet raised a finger, catching Wilson's eye. To Pounceman's clear charging, he was invited to make way for another speaker. With due respect, Mr. Chairman, I believe a village green complete with cricket team will actually help prevent revolution. His late lordship, for all his faults, some of which have sadly recently come to light, was popular with his workers and his tenants because he had, as they would put it, no side, no self-importance, one might say. He played alongside people earning a pittance and came to care for them. He insisted food parcels were dispatched when illness struck a family. He knew everyone by name. I won't say he was a model landlord, and that was partly because his agent was quietly feathering his own nest, I suspect, but because he knew his men and they knew him. If violence had ever arisen, he would never have permitted the militia to lay a hand on them, and I believe his men would have guarded them with their lives. Wilson nodded gravely. Mrs. Arden. Although I thought I knew her well, she surprises me. Prithee, sir, why not have proper sanitation? Someone I know lost his wife and family to the cholera in Manchester. He says that with clean water from pipes and, forgive the term, water closets, such a dreadful disease could never flourish. And I know this is out of order, sir, but I'd like to see piped water and bathrooms and water closets here in the house too. Those nurses Dr. Page brought in, they say you have to be extra particular when you've got sick people. Beg pardon, sir. She subsided, her blushes painful to behold. Wilson produced a rare smile. Thank you, Mrs. Arden. An excellent idea. We must discuss it further in any other business. Mr. Pounceman, I suspect you have not completed your contribution. What are your thoughts about the church, which I gather does not conform to your own ideas? They did not. Finally, we reached any other business. By now, I was sure I could see another little smile playing across Wilson's austere features. But he maintained his calm and judicious bearing throughout, even as Pounceman embarked on a diatribe against me. I cannot disapprove of the measures taken to secure the house during the term of his lordship's illness, but nothing will reconcile me to the wholesale changes proposed during our earlier discussions. His lordship may recover, after all. He glanced at Page, who responded with a sad shake of the head. And when he does, he will no doubt expect to find a reasonable amount left in the family coffers. If the Almighty chooses to call him home, when his heir should find his inheritance intact. Oh, we have heard that it is a second cousin, probably living in the antipodes. We have heard all about Mr. Rousey's fruitless attempts to find him, and until he does appear, I say we should veto all these pie-in-the-sky notions. How fortunate, Wilson said quietly, that given the urgency of the project, we will not have to wait long. Ladies and gentlemen, his lordship's heir is already in the country. How cool is that? So, awesome read. If you like crime and thriller, this is one for you.